We set ourselves up in 2020, and in 2021 we applied for Heritage Lottery grants, which we were very fortunate to get, and that allowed us to have built for us the website with a digital archive behind it. And if you haven't seen that, or you'd like to know a bit more about it, after the talk, just go and see our colleague Caroline, who's sitting staring at the screen over there, but we've got it, we can show you what it looks like. We were set up originally to do two things. One was to digitise the Rockley Village archive, which was a whole series of documents, articles and photographs collected by one of our parish councillors who's now retired. And everybody's fascinated to see them, but they only ever came out at village events. And then they sort of went back into his little box bedroom and nobody really sort of saw them. And we thought, well, actually, if we could get them digitised and make them available online, then they're available for anybody. And that was one thing. The second thing we wanted to do was, we knew that there were a lot of people in the area working on bits of project and research and things that interested them, whether it was their house, the history of, or the history of the local sort of artefacts or whatever. And once they'd done that work, there was nowhere for them to put it, so that again, other people could either look at it and add to it. So those were the two things that we thought we wanted to do when we started. Since then, it's grown a bit. Caroline, I think we're now up to about 11 archive collections, something like that, and lots of bits of project work. So it's grown like Topsy over the last 3 years. When we set it up, we very deliberately didn't define what the surrounding area, so we are Rockley and the surrounding area, and we never defined the surrounding area, quite deliberately, because what we were keen to do is to encourage anybody else in the surrounding area who'd got an interest in the history to sort of come and join in. And so one of the messages from tonight is we'd love to have more people from Marks with an interest in the history of Marks and maybe some research that they're doing on things about Marks' history. Come and join us, and we can stick it on the website and get it publicised and public, and then give people the opportunity to add to it. And again, these things tend to grow like Topsy. So if you'd like to know more about us, come and chat to us. There's various of us from the history group sort of sitting around the outside edge. Come and chat to us at the end of the talk. Or alternatively, give us your email details and we'll put you on our mailing list. We produce an email newsletter every couple of months, which just gives you an update on what we've been doing, what's coming along, what's new on the website to go and look at. So that's a bit about us. Manny's going to give us a talk, so I think I don't need to introduce him, do I? Because as you've come in, most of you have gone, oh, hello Manny, nice to see you again. But for those that don't know, Manny lives locally. He's on our steering group, so he's part of the Rockley History Network and Archive group. A great help to us, and he runs all of our stuff related to the sort of prehistory as opposed to more recent history. So, Manny, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks a bunch, Carol. Thank you. Just to make sure, can everyone hear me okay at the back? Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much, Carol. Thank you, everyone here, for coming. Yeah, I've written the names down because I had so many helping hands today. So thank you so much to Keith, Tom, Carol, Caroline, Michael, Penny, Hilary, and Vanessa. Thank you so much. Sorry if I've left any names out. It's been a real. Wouldn't be able to do without you, so thank you so much. And obviously thank you so much to everyone coming today. Very surprised, I always say this, I'm very surprised how many people are interested in this old rubbish, but, well, pleasantly surprised. Yeah, so a little bit about me. Like Carol said, my name is Manny. I live just around the corner from here. I've lived in Marks for about 14 years or so. In the last 2 years I've been at university abroad because university here is very expensive. Yeah, I've always been interested in history and archaeology and all that rubbish, and the past 4 years or so I've been quite interested in the local history and archaeology, especially the prehistory, especially the Stone Age. And that's why I decided to do this talk. The Stone Age is so often overlooked, prehistory altogether is so often overlooked as just that bit that happened before the interesting stuff, and I think that couldn't be further from the truth. It's just a lack of knowledge, a lack of information and research. So after 4 years of digging around, looking on fields, boring people, I've decided to bore you a little bit this evening. So thanks again for coming along, and yeah, let's start. Well, quickly perhaps with the name BCE, you've already received a few snarky comments about BCE. BCE is the newfangled word for BC. Basically just means before Common Era, but it's just it's a non-religious word. So I just decided to use that to be a bit more inclusive. Yeah, I see shaking heads. Oh, one sec. Yeah, so as all good stories should, we start in the Stone Age. But let's start with some participation, actually. So the Stone Age, as I say, is so often overlooked. How about we get some questions? Sorry, how about I ask some questions? Where do we think the Stone Age ends? So often, even 100 years can seem like a totally ungraspable amount of time. 200 years, 1,000 years, 300,000 years. The longer ago it seems, the less conceivable it is. So I've decided to unravel English archaeology and history, British archaeology and history, into 24 hours, into a 24-hour timeline. So let me explain the concept. So midnight on the left-hand side, 0 a.m., is the very first hominid in Britain. So the very first trace, the very first artifacts, the very first human who set foot on the British Isles, if we can imagine that. Sorry. And we are right now at 11:59. So we're at the most modern stage of history. So where do we think the Stone Age ends? So this is the question, where do we think the Stone Age ends? I'm looking for a time of the day. What time of the day does the Stone Age end? Maybe the morning? Hands up. 3 in the morning? 3 a.m.? So 3 hours of the day, perhaps? 8 p.m. Any other? 11:30 p.m. 2:51, yeah.
11:45
a.m.?
Yeah.
So perhaps you're of the opinion it's, morning. You know, a reasonable chunk, but not the largest chunk. Perhaps you may be a little bit more generous. Maybe you think, well, probably mid-afternoon. What if I were to tell you it's about here? If I were to tell you it's about 11:53 p.m. So, oh my goodness. So the last 7 minutes of our 24-hour clock have been everything in the Stone Age, and that's the British Isles alone. So that's not the world. If this were the world, we'd be in the last 2 seconds. Not even that. The Stone Age is an inconceivably long period of time. Gosh. An inconceivably long period of time. So, again, so inconceivable. So, I'm just going to give up with this. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. I'm going to shout. Yeah, so these, I mean, you can barely even see it from the back, I'm sure, this slither. So let's zoom in a little bit more. Probably still pretty much invisible. Now I've added some colourful stripes to it, probably also invisible. This is every single historical period since the Stone Age in the British Isles alone. So the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Romans, the Middle Ages, and modern. So every single thing that you learned about in school is on here, or hopefully you learned about in school. The Beaker people, the Maiden Castle being built, the Roman invasion, Battle of Hastings, the Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, everything is in these last 7 minutes of the 24 hours. So this is what infuriates me as a Stone Age archaeologist. We completely ignore the Stone Age. They were some morons with rocks, we think, and we focus on the last 7 minutes, and that's something that really, really irritates me. So this was just an exercise to show you how long this period is. But anyway, back to local history. What is the oldest archaeology in 4 Marks? Now, this is a rhetorical question. We're very fortunate enough in 4 Marks, if I get out our 24-hour clock again, we're very fortunate enough to have some of the earliest archaeology, or some of the earlier archaeology in England, from the period known as the Lower Paleolithic. So because the Stone Age is so mahusively massive, we've had to divide it up into sub-periods. And those sub-periods themselves are so utterly massive, we've had to divide those into sub-periods. So it's explaining a lot of archaeology, so do excuse me. The Lower Paleolithic is the first step of the first period. So it's the first of the first. And we are very fortunate enough to have some archaeology from this period from around 600,000 years ago. So maybe a bit small, sorry if you can't read it from back there. 800,000 BC to around 150,000 BC. So what is this archaeology? Well, we are fortunate enough to have a hand axe from 4 Marks. Here it's actually a 3D scan of a hand axe. The original is unfortunately still abroad. It's being analysed. It's sitting in my room. And it probably doesn't look like the typical hand axe you might be used to. That's because the bottom half is missing. I didn't pick a very good colour to show this, but the hand axe basically goes around like this. So that typical egg shape, the chicken Kiev shape, as some might say. was there, but through glacial action, through basically centuries and centuries of damage, it's lost that bottom half. So there's another scan. Very sorry I couldn't bring it with me today. So this is the first artifact from 4 Marks, for now at least. Excuse me. This isn't the only hand axe, though. Another one was found in Ropley. So if anyone came to last year's talk, they might have actually seen this in person. This is the chicken Kiev. If you see it in person, you'll know why. It's the same color, it's the same shape as a chicken Kiev. It's got that typical bump in the middle where the butter usually is. It's really as if they knew what they were making. So it's been called the Ropley chicken Kiev by Anna, my girlfriend. Yeah, so credit where credit's due, exactly. And this was found in the 90s in Ropley. And again, I've decided to pick a very poor color. You can barely see this, but there's an arrow pointing up quite early in our 24-hour timeline at the top. So this is found, if you excuse the pun, within probably 4 or 5 a.m. of our 24-hour clock. So nice and early. Yeah? Oh, good idea. Sorry. There we go, sorry. Thanks, Caroline. Yes. So this is just the first step of the Paleolithic, because the Paleolithic is, as I say, so long. Let's get our timeline out again. Don't worry, I will stop at some point. The lower Paleolithic is followed by the middle Paleolithic. And we are, again, very fortunate to have some archaeology from this period. The middle Paleolithic is actually very poorly represented in Hampshire as a whole. Lower Paleolithic hand axes are here and there. As you know, you probably know them yourself. Whereas the middle Paleolithic, for a number of reasons, is not so well represented in the archaeological record. And this period begins around 150,000 BCE to around 40,000 BCE. And in fact, I've got one of these artifacts with me here. I can just handily pick it up. This is a 300,000 years old or so side scraper. So old, in fact, that it wasn't made by a human being. It was made by probably Homo heidelbergensis or Homo neanderthal, so our grandparents or our cousins, genetically speaking. We do have another artifact from this period. We don't have a lot, but 2 artifacts is better than most places. We also have a so-called core, a Levallois core. I won't get into the reason why it's called Levallois core, but just believe me, it's an old rock, and it's interesting. So after the Middle Paleolithic, doesn't come the later Paleolithic. No, archaeologists have to be difficult. We call it, oh, well, okay, I wrote it there. Ignore that. The Upper Paleolithic, excuse me. And as you can see, as we go further along, this trend will keep continuing. Each period will become narrower and narrower and narrower until it's barely even a hairline wide. And this period lasted only 30,000 years. And you can see 30,000 years compared to the rest is still nothing, which, again, boggles my mind. And again, very fortunate to have later Paleolithic, Upper Paleolithic archaeology, in specific a arrowhead, a type of arrowhead called a shouldered point, or a microlith, and a core. A core is basically a bit of rock, which was usually discarded, from which blade-like long shards, long flakes of flint were struck, and then it was actually disposed of. And from this elongated form, it's quite a large thing as well, actually. They tend to be quite small, but this one's quite large. I can say that it's late Paleolithic, Upper Paleolithic. So the Upper Paleolithic, this period coincides partially with one of the last ice ages. And then after this ice age ended, Britain started warming up, as you might expect. And in this warming up, a lot of tree growth occurred. So Britain became a much more wooded place, much more forested place, and this provided the population of Britain with a new material that they needed to control, that they could take advantage of, or not a new material, but a larger quantity of this material, that material being wood. And so in this time we see the first axes, the first adzes as well. So although earlier I showed you a hand axe is actually a 19th century name for a big knife. A hand axe was actually used for cutting animal bits, for pounding nuts and so on, probably not used for actually chopping down trees like an axe. However, this is an adze. An adze, I certainly didn't know what it was until I Googled it, is a horizontally hafted axe, if you can imagine that. So basically the mattock, a pick equivalent to an axe. So it would be hafted like this, it would be used like this. Indeed, this is one of the very few found locally. They are quite rare finds, but a very nice example of that. Again, very lucky to have other artifacts from this period as well. A Mesolithic mace head with stone that's actually made, was originally from Scotland or Wales even, which shows that probably around 10,000 years ago or so, there was a connection between the people here and the connection and people far up north and to the northwest. This wasn't found in Marks though. You'll have to excuse me, I will have to reach outside the parish every now and then. This was found in Hattingley in Medstead in the 1950s. And if you want to see it, you can go to the Alton Curtis Museum. They have quite a few nice artifacts from the area, quite a few from Marks and Ropley as well. So if you're interested in this part, I'd certainly recommend the Curtis Museum because they're actually shutting soon as well, because they're lacking funding. But that's a digression. As you can probably tell, it's missing a bit. Again, it would have had this hole in the middle. I've got a newer mace head here from the Neolithic, and it would have this very typical hole, which would be hafted onto a stick, like so. And in this case, it might have been used for ceremonial purposes. We're not quite sure. And not a lot of these have been found, so we're not quite sure what they were used for, possibly dispatching animals, possibly for hammering in things. Here's a hafted example. This is a replica, not an original. Other finds from this period include microliths, again, type of arrowheads, similar to what we saw earlier. However, these are much smaller, and they would have been used in something called a composite arrow, where multiple flakes, multiple microliths, these small bits of flint, would have been hafted in the sides and at the ends of these arrowheads, basically creating really deadly weapons that once shot at animals, pulling them out would basically kill the animal. We have some gorgeous examples of these arrowheads where we have several barbs on the sides and several points, so they're really just a stick with lots of razors attached to them, so they would have done a lot of damage back in the day. And we're very fortunate, again, to have these because they're not very common finds, especially in this part of Hampshire. So after the Mesolithic come the first agriculturalists and the first people who start to settle more long-term in the Neolithic. And that's how we can distinguish the Neolithic from the Mesolithic. The Mesolithic is still hunter and gatherers. They don't have ceramics. They don't really live in places for long times. They follow herds of animals. They're seasonal. They might have the odd hut or two, but they certainly don't live in the same place like we do these days for years. And indeed, at the beginning of the Neolithic, they didn't either. The early Neolithic was also likely quite nomadic, with people moving from field to field, following herds, moving around a lot. Only in the later Neolithic do we have people who really stay in certain places for their whole life with very little movement. So again, looking at our timeline, people have only really been staying still for the last few minutes of our day. Finds from this period include the very famous Neolithic axe heads. I'm sure you're all very familiar with these types of finds. Again, some very nice examples from Ropley. Marks itself has produced quite a few examples. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any. Some have been stolen out of museums in the past 30, 40 years because they are so valuable. Others have been just lost to the ravages of time in general, sold to private collectors and so on. So I've had to resort to my own collection of axe heads from Ropley. I hope you can excuse this great sin. Yes, Marks says actually created about 10 to 12 axe heads, as in that 10 to 12 axe heads have been found within the parish within the last 100 years or so. So again, quite fortunate to have that. As you can see, the axe head on the right doesn't exactly look like one. That's because the upper bit is missing. It would have looked something like that originally. Not too similar from the one on the left, but quite a bit bigger. Neolithic arrowheads are also quite common finds actually around here. I've brought 5 with me here. We can have a look at those later. These arrowheads are, again, quite nice examples. Show that although these people were reliant on grains and they were the first agriculturalists and would have kept livestock and would have bred them and so on, they were still in part reliant on hunting. There is some evidence from Europe as well that these arrows were actually used for intertribal warfare as well, but I can't say that from these arrowheads and I wouldn't be prepared to make that statement either. We don't have the evidence at the moment in England. And of course, the aforementioned Neolithic mace head. If you've seen the poster for the talk, you'll see that this was the background. I chose this as the background because, I'll be honest, it's probably my best find. It's likely a ceremonial tool that was used in very special circumstances, although there is a lot of use where suggesting it was used as a day-to-day tool as well. But these types of artifacts are very rare, especially here, and suggest, yes, a complex society, a complex local community with hierarchy. Perhaps the top of the hierarchy wielded this tool, and perhaps they, yes, were somehow viewed as above everyone else. Because in the Neolithic, we also see the first evidence of hierarchies. We start to see people who were buried in special ways, given a lot of money and a lot of grave goods, suggesting, again, their superiority to other people. And for those who came to the table, I deliberately did not explain this artifact because I wanted some audience participation so I can drink a little bit. So I'll let you puzzle through. Maybe you can think what this is, and when some of you are ready, you can put your hand up and let me know if you've got any ideas of what this might be, this tool here, from Cornwall. Grinding stone, that's a good guess. Good guess. Any others? Who said that? Yes, Carol, yes. Yes, it is an axe head, yeah. It is indeed an axe head. A very nice axe head. As you can see, the stone is actually from Cornwall. So I found it here in Marks a few years ago, but it's not a natural stone. So if you go on any field here, you will only find this stone if it's an artifact. So you won't find this stone naturally. The only stone we have here naturally is flint. Unless you go a little bit east, then you get sandstone. But here, the only stone that naturally occurs is flint. So really, if you find any stone on a field, unless it's been somehow disturbed with building rubble, that isn't flint. It's been imported, and it's an artifact, which actually makes field walking here really easy. If I find something that isn't flint, I know it's an artifact, and I put it in my pocket. That's why I've got lots of rubbish there. So again, this is probably another symbol of the hierarchy that we have of the local community. This axe head, to be transported from Cornwall 4,000 years ago, would have taken so much time and effort, so much foot traffic, and also making this is unbelievable. The amounts of hours that would have been spent basically reducing a large slab of igneous stone, volcanic stone, into a small palm-sized, I'll get the axe head out, it's not that large, into a small palm-sized axe head would have taken hours and hours and hours of work. So if you'll excuse the comparison, this is almost like the Porsche, perhaps even the Ferrari of the Neolithic, because this axe head, the amount of money, the amount of wealth, the amount of prestige hidden within this artifact is equivalent to perhaps such a car as today. Because although the tool might not have been any more useful than a flint axe head, it's the wealth, it's the prestige, it's the meaning and the value attached to it that makes it such an important thing. Like a Ferrari. A Ferrari is a car like anything else. Sure, it goes a bit quicker, but it's the wealth and it's the prestige associated with that brand. And not just one of these artifacts has been found in the vicinity, but rather two, or possibly even three. So I found another two fragments quite close to each other on another field in Ropley. And they may fit together, if I'm missing the middle bit, but they also might be two separate artifacts. And you can have a look at these later on the table, suggesting even more communities. And these were found in different fields, so that suggests at least two different communities at this time. And realistically, all throughout Hampshire, there is a lot of archaeology from the Neolithic, suggesting really a very rich, a very vibrant Neolithic society and a very complex society at this point, connecting all around the world. So again, Cornish flint. I've also had flint from near the Thames appear in some of these contexts. Sandstone from far away as well. Sandstone probably from Sussex. So we've got a very vibrant culture, far more than what we usually give them credit for. I mean, I say I say Stone Age and you think caveman, but in reality, we've got a very complex society here. But you're probably asking yourself, why on earth was there so much activity in the Stone Age in Marks and in the vicinity? If we look at Marks these days, I'm sure it's quite a bustling place, but that's only a recent occurrence. Prior to this, Marks, as we'll see later, was little more than a couple of fields. So why was there so much activity in the Stone Age? The soil wasn't particularly attractive. The soil's always been a bit of a burden here, as you can ask any farmer and he'll tell you that. Also, the altitude is a difficulty. Foot traffic, traveling here is not easy, as I'm sure everyone knows. And there's no natural water. At least there isn't these days. And I end on that point because, well, first of all, I'll ask you actually, what do you think about this map? What do those, well, first of all, does anyone know what this is a map of? Sorry. It's an alien? It's aerial, yes, indeed, of Marks actually. So it's not quite aerial. I mean, it was taken from the air, but this is a LiDAR map. And this works almost similar to radar, but it shoots laser at soil or the earth, and it measures how long it takes for them to come back, and basically it maps out the terrain, maps out the topography of a surface, of a landscape, and from that we're able to see the humps and bumps. And it's really helpful for archaeology because we can actually look under the trees. The software can also remove trees from viewing the topography, so you can actually see underneath woodlands and so on, which is amazing. But the reason I chose it here is because it shows really well these valleys. Now, not a trick question, but what do these valleys look like? They're dry these days. They look like rivers, exactly. That's because they were once rivers. That's because Marks, not even 2,000 years ago, Marks was full of rivers. Marks was a beautiful, lush wetlands landscape. plenty of streams and rivers to not only water residents, not only water humans here, but also provide a good environment for animals to hunt. For animals to hunt and for humans to then hunt those animals. So we have a really different view of the landscape than we do these days. Obviously, Formox is very dry. In fact, that's why Formox was unsettled for such a long time. There was just no water here and the soil was unredeeming. So there we go. So following the Neolithic being the final period of the Stone Age, comes the Bronze Age. And you probably can't even see the Bronze Age on there. So I'll zoom in a little bit more. There's the Bronze Age. So the Bronze Age lasted just under 2,000 years. And again, we've got some Bronze Age archaeology here. Probably the best way to see them is through the barrows that dot the landscape of Hampshire. In Formox and Medstead, we've got about 5, 6, 7, 8 in total. These 4, the cluster in the middle is actually quite a new discovery, which suggests, again, special activity there. But yes, barrows have been known for centuries. In fact, even our Anglo-Saxon ancestors, if you want to call them that, knew of them and even named them for us. So some barrows are even named directly. Bronze Age finds are also quite numerous. In fact, one of the most famous Bronze Age finds from all of Hampshire was found not very far away in Ropley, and that is the Lyaway Torque. The Lyaway Torque would have been a bit of arm jewellery worn roughly around here, and it's made of solid gold, and it really is about this big. You can see a replica of it in Curtis Museum, but the original is, for some reason, in Truro Museum in Cornwall. But it was originally found in the 1840s, and miraculously it survived since then. A lot of archaeology found back then was melted down or sold and went into the black market, but this has remarkably survived. And it's Middle Bronze Age, so it's a little bit later, but it's one of the most outstanding Bronze Age finds from all of Hampshire. And we're very lucky to have that from here. So next time you're in Cornwall, ask them for our archaeology back. Another nice find is this flat axe head, or flat axe. And this is really quite a big thing. I haven't seen it in person, but the pictures show that it's really quite a large thing, 12, 13 centimeters long. And that was found not far away from Formox in Ropley. And again, these finds suggest, again, quite a complex society. And also in the Bronze Age, we have stone finds, which might sound a bit baffling. It's called the Bronze Age. Why is there stone in the Bronze Age? We don't have iron in the Stone Age, or we don't have iron in the Bronze Age. So why is there stone in the Bronze Age? Well, I like to compare it to smartphones. I like to compare the new burgeoning technology of bronze that came to Britain around 4,500 years ago. I like to compare it to smartphones because when it first arrived, a lot of people knew about it. It's a technology that quickly spread, but it was very expensive. It was very expensive for a long time, so people would continue to use the technology that came before smartphones. So I'm sure very many people here had bricks or pre-smartphones until, well, some of you still might. So it's no wonder that bronze, which was in a very expensive material, the copper would have had to have been sourced from mainland Europe, and tin would have had to have been sourced from Cornwall. So it's a very, and the technology wasn't also known by everyone. So it was a very expensive material. So stone was used well into the Bronze Age, possibly even up until the Iron Age. We have some evidence of that. So that's why we get some very nice tools like this dagger on the left. Here's a poor reconstruction that I did on my laptop quickly. With a hafted handle, sorry, just a handle. And on the right, a very typical barbed and tanged arrowhead, which can be found all throughout Hampshire. And a nice example of that found not far away in Blackberry Lane. So after the Bronze Age comes the Iron Age. Again, a very thin sliver of time, but it did encompass actually little under 8 centuries, in fact, little over 8 centuries of history. Again, unfortunately, I have to go outside of Formox for this. There's not too much evidence in Formox. If any of you have ever been to the Castle of Comfort in Medstead, you might know that just north of it, there's a small earthwork, possibly a Iron Age hill fort. And again, if I apply this technology, which I was talking about earlier, this LiDAR technology, we can see underneath the trees. And underneath this copse, like I say, just north of the Castle of Comfort, we can see this quite impressive hook-shaped earthwork. Now, this hook-shaped earthwork was interpreted by archaeologists in the 60s to actually only be medieval, so only about 400, 500 years old. But I would like to disagree because, the form is very untypical, very atypical for the other archaeologists seem to think so as well. But the only real way of finding out is if we dig it. So At some point, it would be lovely to dig this as well as any other thing, but unfortunately, it's on private land, and digging is a huge resource problem, getting the diggers, getting the funding, getting the equipment, so we might not be able to see the answer anytime soon, but it's something that we can at least hope for. Other than hill forts, which are probably the most famous type of Bronze Age, Iron Age settlement, we have banjo enclosures, which aren't so well known. Now, why are they called banjo enclosures? Well, maybe if I show you this crop mark and highlight part of the crop mark, you can see that there's a roundish body, there's a short neck, and there's a bit of a headstock. So this is actually what they're called in archaeology. This is the official terminology for them. Banjo enclosures are very typical, probably your day-to-day Iron Age enclosures. So this is where the middle and working class of Iron Age people would have lived. But what would it have looked like? Some abstract crop mark isn't really going to tell us much. So I've gotten my very poor art skills to try and reimagine what this would have looked like. So there we go. That's something, that's a possibility. So it's definitely not what happened. Again, we haven't dug it. But you know, people would have lived in there. There would have been roundhouses. There would have been plough fields and all sorts. So, exactly. There would have been pits for digging chalk, flint, and clay, from which they would have built houses from, built structures from, or made pottery from. There would have been animal pens to keep livestock. I couldn't be bothered to draw that many horses, so you just have to fill it in. There was a well for water, roundhouses for obviously living in, and a long ditch system. So that's actually what we're seeing in that crop mark picture from earlier. That's actually basically these ancient ditches from however many thousands of years ago that have basically been filled in with more fertile earth so that the roots from plants can actually grow deeper into them, so they mature quicker, so they come up as green marks, so basically more mature crops compared to the not so mature plants around them. So now I have to skip forward. Yes, what about finds from this period? Unfortunately, in Marks we're not too blessed with finds, mostly because everything is houses here. But a coincidental find found not far away from here, actually, basically at the bottom of the lane where Blackberry Lane meets Leamington Bottom. A loom weight was found, a loom weight being used to keep the vertical fabric taut whilst horizontal bits of fabric could be drawn across to basically make clothing. So from this one find, we can basically say there was an active community here and they were making their own fabric, which I find fascinating. Other than this, we have Iron Age beads made from fossil sponge. I think this is another nice example because it shows, again, just from one find alone, that there was connections with other parts of the UK. These sorts of fossil sponges only really occur in sandstony areas, so again, it shows a connection with West Sussex, East Sussex. And here's a whole example found in Surrey, in Guildford Museum currently. As I'm sure you all know, after the Iron Age came the Roman occupation in around 43 CE to 410 CE. And again, similar problem to the Iron Age, everything is houses here, so we don't really have a lot of plough soil, we don't have a lot of things we can dig and search to say if there was Roman occupation in Marks. But one thing that is interesting, an interesting possibility, are the Roman roads. So there are some confirmed Roman roads going through Marks and Ropley and some possible Roman roads. A lot of these have been dug. They were dug quite a few years ago, and some are actually being dug this year to confirm whether they are indeed roads or not. But as I'm sure you all know, Roman roads tend to be straight. They're not always dead straight. They're not always these dead straight lines, you know, which are aligned to north, south, east, or west. They do take deviations, but they tend to be straighter than the wiggly lanes of the later medieval periods. And indeed, we can even see some in crop marks. This is quite a nice one, quite visible. You can see where a ditch accompanied a road that ran quite straight across two fields. Again, Roman finds, not too many in Marks at least, plenty from Ropley, plenty from other parishes. These two were just found just outside of Marks in Chawton. On the left, we see a silver denarius, a Roman coin, and on the right, we see a brooch. And I've got a silver denarius with me here, but not as good quality, unfortunately. So yes. Then after the Roman period comes the early medieval period. Again, we're getting thinner and thinner with our lines here. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of archaeology from this period either, but that's not just Marks, that's most of England. Early medieval archaeology, also known as Anglo-Saxon archaeology, is very small because the Anglo-Saxons left not much of a trace, at least not in their early residence. The best, or the closest we can get to archaeology from this period is through the place names that they left with us. So, as I'm sure you know, English derived from Old English, the language which these Anglo-Saxon settlers spoke. So quite a number of local place names actually derive from this. And if this is something that interests you, I'm doing a talk in Ropley in about a month's time on the place names of Ropley and Formarks. It's something that certainly interests me, so feel free to come along to that as well. So Balcomore Close, not far away from here, on Blackberry Lane. You might think it's just some modernly invented name. It's actually quite an old one, recorded in the same document as Formarks is for the first time. So it's recorded about 500 years ago, but its name is actually far older, like I say, Anglo-Saxon, and it means the pond by the beech tree. From Bock meaning beech tree and Mere meaning pond. And that's actually where we get the word for Lake Windermere as well, Windermere, Mere meaning pond or lake or body of water, so there's a famous example. Brisden's Lane is also not a modern invention. Brisden's Lane was recorded in 1403, and it means the ploughfield where the gladflies are. It might also mean the ploughfield on its own, but most likely means this. And this referred to actually the land at either side of where the large telegraph pole is, the large telephone pole is, near the big pile of manure. And I'm not referring to Formarks. West Tisted is also quite an old name. In fact, recorded 1,100 years ago in 932 CE. And it means Ticker's farmstead, Titcher or Ticker being a personal name. No relation to chicken tikka, unfortunately. And this document actually provides us with a number of very early place name mentions, such as Stapley Lane. Stapley Lane is also mentioned in this document in Ropley. Other names include Ropley itself. Ropley is actually mentioned quite a bit later in the 12th century, and it means Hropper's farmstead. And Hropper is a cute diminutive of Hrodbiot, which means Robert, basically, the red-bearded one. So Ropley literally means the farmstead in the woodland clearing of the man with the bloke with the red beard. And then Rotherfield Park, just around the corner, means the open field where cattle are kept. So basically a cattle field. I always find it funny because Rotherfield these days is quite a hidden away, wealthy estate. And think about in the Anglo-Saxon time, it literally just meant the cow pat field. Very funny. So after the early medieval period comes the Middle Ages, and following the Middle Ages, also the post-medieval period. Now, I've grouped these two together here because I don't want to bore you, but I'll have to say it again, there's just not a lot of evidence from the medieval period in Formarks, but the post-medieval period offers a lot more archaeology and evidence. So I've grouped them together so I don't have to bore you and say, well, I don't have anything, but here's some rubbish to fill the time. So the commons. Some of you might know that Formarks consisted of the commons of 4 parishes, 5 parishes technically as well. What are the commons? Well, the commons were collectively owned pieces of land that certain villagers, certain parishioners were allowed to use for cattle, for grazing, for ploughfield. And these commons were never really designated, as in they were never really founded or created, but they sort of precipitated over the years. And the reason Formarks is literally right in these concentrations of these 5 commons is because, as I say, Formarks is on the ridge of East Hampshire, the East Hampshire Ridge, which was, like I say, not the best quality soil. And it's not that one day some evil landowners got together and said, well, let's give these peasants some crap land. Rather, it happened over time. It was a very long process where the better quality land was confiscated by, not confiscated, but basically taken by private landowners who would then rent it out to tenants. And then over time, basically the land that got left over, the commons, which were really unattractive pieces of land, were then made officially commons, lands that everyone could use, or everyone owned, but some could use. And which parishes are these? Well, in the top left, northwest, we have Medstead, Chawton, Farringdon, Ropley, and Newton Valence. And from these 4 parishes in the middle, we actually get the name of Formarks. I'll talk about that more later. But Newton Valence also gave up some of its land to create Formarks as well. So there we have it. These black lines, by the way, are just the parish boundaries, and the coloured areas are the commons. So we're pretty sure about Chawton, Farringdon, and Newton Valence, that those commons were where they are on the map, whereas Medstead and Ropley we're not too sure. We're not sure where they ended. Interestingly, the commons were, well, they no longer exist, as I'm sure you know. You can't really go into someone's back garden these days, at least not with a few frowns. That's because they were enclosed, which basically was an act of confiscating these commonly owned lands beginning in the early 18th century. And in fact, the first parish to be enclosed by Act of Parliament, that's a group of greedy landowners went to Parliament and said, can you make us a law, please, was Ropley in 1709. Now, we might not think of this act as being anything more than some sort of 18th century dull legal act, but in reality, it changed the face of the British countryside more than any other act that we can consider. Enclosure was such a major thing. Prior to this, most of the countryside were these big open fields, maybe the odd fence, maybe the odd hedgerow here and there, but really, really large fields with woodlands in between. The rural landscape was then completely changed by enclosure when basically, in order to keep the peasants and the individuals who use these common lands off, they would plant very big and dense hedgerows, which still are on our landscape today. And these hedgerows became so popular that they were planted more and more. And although these days we're actually seeing it, funny enough, go backwards, where larger fields are now made, the small, closely knit textile, the patchwork fields that we have in our imagination is only really something that's about 300 years old. Prior to this, we had big, sprawling fields, especially in the medieval period. So there we go. So this is basically the origin story of Four Marks. Four Marks was basically made on stolen common land that was then basically later sold back to them as a way to make money because these greedy landowners had become bankrupt by the 18th century. So as I say, Ropley was the first to be enclosed, then shortly after followed Medstead, then I think it was Farringdon, then it was Chaunton, and then it was Newton Valence. And basically, it went throughout the rest of the British Isles. These days, I think there's just a handful of commons that are still active and used as agricultural lands, which is a great shame. If you're interested in this topic, there's a very good book written by Chris Heal about Four Marks, which I'm sure many of you have read already. But Four Marks wasn't just empty fields in this period. Sure, it was for a great deal, for a few centuries, but by the 16th century, industry started to come to Four Marks, especially in the 17th century, actually. And this was most notable in the form of brick kilns. Now, brick kilns became especially popular when I believe it was a tax on timber frame houses came in after Charles II came back to power. So bricks became a much more wanted commodity, and brick kilns started popping up all over rural areas in Hampshire. And Four Marks was no exception. Four Marks was actually home to about 7 brick kilns and brickyards from as early as 1640 to as late as 1930. The first brick kiln mentioned in the vicinity was number 5 and 6 here. These are actually in East Tisted, and they're shown in a map of 1640, which you can see on our website. Then the map, the kilns that came after that is number 7 up there, which is actually Brick Kiln in Chawton Park, which is now Brick Kiln Farm, imaginatively named. And then number 4 came afterwards. That's the Swelling Hill Pond. So if you're ever walking around Swelling Hill Pond and thinking, why is there so many lumps and bumps here? That's because they were all brick kilns, and those were the pits where clay was dug and collected. So there's something interesting. And the rest were not around for a long time, a few decades in most cases. But indeed, number 7, the Brick Kiln in Chawton Park, was around for quite a few years, probably around 150 years. And on the left, we can see a very interesting receipt for the costs of running Chawton Park, basically how much wood the individual had bought, how much labor he had expended, how much food he needed, and so on, and how much clay he'd paid others to collect. So, very interesting document. And as I say, it's connected to number 7. Other industries locally, or if you can call them industries, other landmarks locally, were the windmills. Now, these days, none are left, but throughout the 18th and 19th century, and in Ropley, even in the late medieval period, there were several windmills in the countryside. Now, mills are core to grain agriculture. You can't really do much with grain other than sell it as animal feed. So it would have to obviously be ground into flour. And being that there were no major waterways here, at least not in the post-medieval period in the 18th and 17th century, windmills had to be used to basically harness the power of wind to grind this flour down. Most of you will probably still remember the Windmill Inn, which is now the Co-op, and that's not just named because they liked the word. There was indeed a windmill there. A very mysterious windmill, I have to say, and I say mysterious because we have no idea when it was there, when it was gone. We just know that in 1759, it was called the Old Windmill Stone. So it suggests clearly that by the 1750s it had gone, but whether it had been gone for 50 years, 100 years, 10 years, 1 year, we can't say. The building you see at the bottom there was built quite a bit after, probably at the end of the 18th century, but that's not the same co-op you see today. This pub actually burnt down in the 1920s and then was rebuilt shortly after, so the co-op today is actually no older than about 100 years. Other windmills stood here and there, though, most notably opposite Travelodge, which is now a couple of houses. There was another windmill, which we have a very nice advert for from 1779, which is selling a very attractive post windmill with one pair of French, I can't read that, and other things. So yeah, we have a landscape full of windmills and not this barren landscape with just fields and no one on it. And indeed, by the 18th century, there were quite a few farmsteads here and there, most notably in Hawthorne, a small hamlet in Marks where there were quite a few farmsteads since the 16th century. But indeed, what is a Marks? Well, I already spoiled it, I said it earlier. This record is from 1550, and I think it's quite a nice description, and describes for us quite nicely that there was nothing here. It's a certain empty piece of land called Marks near Bookmere, and named thus because 4 tithings abut there mutually, that is to say, the tithings of Medstead, Ropley, Farringdon, and Chawton. Which suggests to us that Marks is actually not much older, as in the name. Marks is probably about 500 years old from the 1550s, because you pretty much never, ever get a description or an explanation of a name in a document. That rarely happens. You usually just get a name and then it moves on. The fact that it's described here is very interesting. But this wasn't just an empty piece of land, or at least not where the Marks were. Indeed, it was marked by a boundary marker. And the reason I show you this picture of a grassy corner is because this boundary marker stood here until the 1960s. So this is taken from the A31, and this is the footpath going here, and this is basically between Boyneswood Road, which is just up here, and Co-op down there. And if I show you a picture from 1913, we can see the Marks stone. And this right here, which this old gentleman is being bumped on, I'll explain that in a bit, is the Marks stone. Like I say, unfortunately, it was lost in the 1960s, and as far as I know, this is the only picture of the Marks stone. But why was there a stone here? Well, historically, parish boundaries had to be delineated by physical markers. In the very early periods, these were usually features, so trees, special trees or lanes, junctions were used, and that's probably what the story is behind Marks, why this specific spot was chosen as a boundary marker, because this is where the A31, historically quite a significant route, met with Boyneswood Road, and right at this point there was a marker placed. So yes, let me explain bumping. It looks quite like an odd thing. Bumping and beating the bounds, as it is called, is a tradition which is quite old, probably dates back to the medieval period. And this was an annual act where certain villagers, usually the youngest men and the oldest men, would get together and they would walk around the whole village, and not just any part of the village, but the village boundaries. And they would cut anew, which is what they refer to, they would cut anew the boundary markers. So these were usually stakes, wooden stakes or stones that were then either cleaned of moss, or in the cases of wooden markers, had somehow overgrown or gotten dirty and were cut anew to make them more vibrant and more visible parish boundary markers. Because in this time, parish boundaries were very important. We didn't have maps, at least not most people had maps. So it was very important that the landscape was actually marked and delineated, and you would know which parish you were in. So that's why we have parish boundaries here, and the Marks stone indeed. But unfortunately, so many of these have been stolen, have been damaged, have been destroyed, that, well, not only the Marks stone has disappeared, but pretty much every other local, rural boundary marker. In fact, I've searched for many and I haven't been able to find a single one, which is a great shame. But it is usually that they get stolen, but I don't know who hoards them. So that's what beating the bounds is. Bumping, what's bumping? Well, it is what it says on the can, literally getting lifted up and bumped on a stone. In most cases, it was usually children to remind them where a parish boundary is, I believe. I might be wrong on that. But in this case, I think perhaps comedically, which is why you see quite a few smirking faces, they did it for one of the oldest people in the village, the rector of Chawton. They decided to bump him on the stone so that he doesn't forget it. Maybe his memory was getting a little bit fuzzy. So there we have it, which I think is a beautiful image. And indeed, this is the boundaries. This house is still there today. So if you drive in from the east, from Alton, going into Marks, keep your eye out for this. It's just before, no, just after the vets on the left-hand side of the road. And we all like a good map, so I thought I'd finish on a map. This is the map of the Farringdon Commons, which I explained earlier. And I thought I'd get the audience participation up again, so whilst I get another drink of water, maybe you can have a puzzle, and when you're ready, put your hands up and let me know where you think this is in Marks. So this is a part of Marks that most of you will know? Yeah, let me know.
Recreation ground?
Mm-mm.
It's got a grow up lake.
No. Any ideas? You should know. I told you. No? Sorry? No. No, sorry, that would be too nice. I'll rotate it. Sorry, I have been cheeky. I haven't rotated it. There you go. Now we have the north to north. The older maps didn't always have north to north. That's quite a new invention, actually. They used to have east to north. In fact, a bit of trivia, that's why it's called orienting a map, because you put the east to the north. That's what they used to do, because orient means east. So to orient a map is to put the east to the north. A bit of trivia. Okay, so now we've got the north at the top. Does anyone recognize this road going diagonally down? Northwest to southeast? No? The A31? No. But the A31 is on there. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So here comes the moment of suspense. Last year we got a good reaction when I did this. So let's hope we get a good one again. Oh. So it's pretty remarkable. So this map is about 300 years old, and it gets a bit fuzzy in the corners, but that's more or less 1-to-1. So what we're looking at here, well, I'll show you in the next slide. So we've got Telegraph Lane, just like you said, spot on. New Copse, quite a nice plantation to walk through, or walk down. Pies Farm. Pies Farm isn't actually on the map, it's just off the map, but it is shown as Pies, or Pies. No, it's Pies. Brightstone Lane is on there, but it's written as Bridestone Lane. Mysterious, I will explain in a bit. And Hawthorne Lane is on there as well, written as Hawthorne Lane. So there you go. So for a 300-year-old map, I don't think that's too bad. I certainly couldn't do a better job. And it's the oldest map of Marks. So there you go. And if you're interested in any of these names, I will explain them in the next talk, especially Bridestone Lane. Well, I'll talk about that now. So indeed, the fable of Bridestone Lane. I'll read this out. There is not far from here, Bridestone Lane. The story concerning it is as follows. Once upon a time, there was a wedding, and the terrible mistake, as it turned out, was made of not inviting the fairies of the neighborhood to the festivities. On the way home from the church, the whole wedding party was turned into stones. Now these large blocks of conglomerate may be seen on the sides of the lanes. So I didn't know about these until I read this book, and it seems not a lot of other people did either. I've met a few who do know these, but these are the local pudding stones. Now, there are quite a few, actually. Pudding stones, unfortunately, or fortunately, aren't actually petrified partygoers. Rather, they are much more boring. They're geological erratics, basically meaning during glacial action from the last ice age, or the last ice ages, and prior to that, sorry, actually, a number of stones were basically transported from other parts of the UK to this part. So this is exactly what that is, basically a stone. I'm not sure where they're originally from, but was basically dragged over here by a glacier and then deposited within the village. What are these stones? The pudding stones, which basically means they are, it's basically like a natural form of cement, so, or concrete even, where you have lots of small pebbles which are basically intermixed in a natural sort of cement. They're actually quite a pretty stone once you get them clean. I've only been able to find one on Brightstone Lane, but there are supposedly quite a few. There's about 3 or 4. So if you're ever going to Pies Farm, check the roadsides there. I managed to dig this one out earlier this year. Hopefully it's still there. Another interesting story attached to them is that supposedly they grow in size day to day. So keep your eyes open for that. But yes, so why are they on the sides of lanes? I find that quite interesting. There's actually another folklore story attached to it. Not sure if that's true either. The story goes that some local farmers wanted to prove who had the fastest horse racing team in the early 19th century, in about the 1820s, and decided that they would use these famous stones on the backs of their carts, and whoever could transport these stones to the other side of the village first would then be deemed as the farmer with the fastest horses. So that's why a lot of these dot the roadsides. So one can be seen by Dunstall Lane. In fact, two can be seen by Dunstall Lane in Ropley. This one's on Brightstone Lane. There's another one in Weldham, East Weldham. There's a few in Farringdon. There's one in Newton Valence. They're all over the shop. So if you've ever got a free minute and you're in the area, I'd recommend go looking for them. But that's all I have to say for now. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, any questions? Hands up, please. Yes, so any questions?
Slightly green stone axe
Yeah.
thing, it looks like it's blunted over time, whereas the flint ones have stayed really intact. Have they blunted over time?
So yeah, that's probably a natural procedure because the igneous rocks and the soil here is really unforgiving. They've probably actually corroded over time. So it's not necessarily to do with their use. It's probably just to do with the soil being really bad around here, like I say. Yeah. Carol?
Do you know anything about, or does anybody know anything about whether there was continuous habitation in the area through, or was the area sort of uninhabited for long periods and then suddenly farming came back?
Yes, so are you talking about prehistory or generally? So with nomadic peoples obviously being the main population of Britain for most of the period, you would have probably had possibly years, months, seasons certainly, where Ropley wasn't an ideal place to live in. So these people were nomadic and they were seasonal based. So maybe Ropley was particularly, and Formarks was particularly attractive in the summer, say. Maybe there were more birds here, and then they would go to some other part of the UK where it was more attractive in winter, where there were more animals at that time. So they'd be following. So there would inevitably be basically nothing here, no people for possibly years. Farming settlements, it's hard to say if there was consistent settlement. Almost certainly this landscape has been consistently used since the Neolithic, but whether one field, one patch of land, or one parish has been consistently used is hard to say. But in Formarks, there's certainly a trace of every single period, but not necessarily every year, not necessarily every century. So it could be that there was a century of nothing here, but we don't know.
The banjo enclosure,
Yeah.
is that, how many people will that house?
It's hard to say. A few have been excavated, but I don't know the details off the top of my head. But I can imagine a few small families living in them, but certainly not like cities. They weren't densely settled by any means. They were probably small farmsteads with an enclosure, basically like a pen.
And how long would that take? Like, would it be like sticks in the ground that they would for the sort of fence around?
Yeah, so it would be a ditch to actually make it, and then it would be palisaded as well, yeah. And actually, that brings me to the point, they were in use for centuries, so I can't give too many details away, because I know where that banjo enclosure is, but detectorists love it, because they find everything from early Iron Age gold coins to late Roman gold coins. Oh, wow. So it doesn't necessarily mean it was settled for that whole time, but certainly the Romans came along, and then they might have used it as an animal pen or whatever. So they were certainly used for centuries. Yes? Yes. Yes, so it's mandatory on some sites. So greenfield sites, I believe, it's mandatory to excavate there. But the problem is because there's obviously pressure, time pressure, money pressure, people power pressure. These sites are excavated very quickly. Not a lot of research is done on them. So there is actually the new development behind Reed's, the butchers, in Medstead. They did a dig there. They actually found one of the very few Neolithic features, one of the very few Neolithic archaeological sites in all of Hampshire there. Report on it, they didn't publish it, they didn't research it further because it's not within their remit. And that's a shame, and in my opinion, that's to do with the state of the privatization of archaeological firms. So as a private company, your main goal is to make money and not necessarily to create good research. So that's my opinion, but it's a shame.
So all these local artifacts have been found locally.
Yeah.
Have they mainly been found by people keeping their eyes open or by digging at development sites? Or
Yeah, so everything here I've collected, apart from the sword that was given to me. But everything I've brought with me today, I've collected over years of field walking. So field walking is asking kindly for permission, and then walking on a ploughed field once it's ploughed. It's a shame because you can only do it really once a year, just after they've ploughed, and hopefully there's usually good rain, because obviously if there's crops on it, you damage the crops, and well, they don't let you on then. So yeah, so I've been lucky to find what I have. Absolutely, and then detectoring as well. I've got some permissions around the villages here, so a lot of the metal finds I found with my detector. So yeah, that's how. But other archaeological finds, I mean, we've been running a program called Have You Found Anything Interesting? Basically where we ask local residents whilst gardening, whilst on dog walks or anything like that, if they found something, and then if they do find it, let us know, because then we can report it with the right people, and then we can know about it. And especially helpful for my research as well, because I'm researching the Stone Age and I need more finds basically. So yes.
The earthworks in Medstead, were they originally have been a complete circle?
Possibly.
Do you think that they're Celtic, because there was a migration from Europe of about 500?
Yes. Yes, exactly. Yes, it is possible. They were originally circular, so it might have been ploughed out. It might have been used as a natural hedgerow. It might have also not have been ploughed out. There are some cases of hill forts basically just using natural promontories and then just enclosing some part of it. So it might be that the other half of the circle was just a fence because it was easily defendable. So that might have been the case.
What's the origins of the A31 then? Was that a traditional road that was there in the west?
Yes, so I mean, we could be here for another hour about the A31. It's got a really fascinating history. It was probably something known as a ridgeway. So basically a high altitude route that would have led major settlements to each other. It's possible it was used since prehistory, since Iron Age times, although the evidence for that is minimal. But it was certainly used before the Romans came. And then the Romans probably straightened it out some parts. That's probably why it's quite straight when it goes through 4 marks. And then yes, after the Romans left, in the medieval period, it was deemed a highway. Most roads were deemed a highway, or quite a number of roads were deemed a highway, but then it was not really a major route until it was turned into a turnpike. In fact, the major route actually went through Medstead and Byton from Winchester to London. It was only in the mid-18th century that it was turned into a turnpike, and then from then on, it was refreshed basically over the decades, and then was turned into the A31 in the 1960s, 50s, yeah. Any more questions?
Slide, no, it's gone.
Yeah.
The windmills, would they have been occupied? Would there have been people living there all the time, or was it a seasonal occupation only?
Living nearby, yes, so it would have been a seasonal occupation.
Yeah.
Obviously, you wouldn't be able to grind grains down all year round, mostly in autumn then. Maybe somewhat in winter, but spring and summer you probably wouldn't have had much to do. No, you wouldn't have lived in the windmills. These were post mills. In fact, the advert describes it as a post mill, which is a very bare bones, simple wooden construction. I'm actually glad you brought that up because I forgot to mention these windmills were, in many cases, actually transportable because they were such a simple wooden construction. So that doesn't mean they were ripped out of the ground and moved. They were deconstructed, and then that wood, because timber was so expensive, was then re-erected into another windmill further on. So that might be the case with the old windmill, so where the windmill inn was. It might be that was taken down and then transported to the Travelodge site, then that was put up there, and then that was eventually demolished at the end of the 19th century.
And are they held in common, or are they private?
No, so as you saw in the advert, it would be privately owned, but I'm not sure on the details. It might have been rented out then, someone would have owned it and they would have rented it out to millers, but milling was certainly, in this part at least, the part of the country, a seasonal profession. So you probably would have been an agricultural worker, and then when autumn came around, you would have been a miller. That's my impression at least.
Thank you.
Any more questions? If not, we have an email address, and this is being filmed by my girlfriend, so you can see the video on it online if you want. Anna, sorry, is her name.
And I'm sure you'd like to join me in thanking Manny and Ben. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
It's one of those talks where you can sort of go off down a rabbit hole in any direction, by just simply saying, tell us a bit more about X or Y or Z. So
Yeah.
thank you, Manny. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much.